Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Thursday, July 25th around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about conference realignment. It feels like we have kind of sidestepped the realignment bug just for the time being, with Clemson and Florida State staying in the ACC through the 2025-26 season. But I feel like there's a landslide on the other side of it, and I'll break down exactly what I mean, how it could likely be the biggest one we have seen yet in the conference realignment world. Then we'll get into kind of a new development in the Connor Stalions case. It sounds like a documentary is going to be made by Netflix. They have kind of done an untold series around some of the biggest stories in sports. This is definitely under that category, so we'll break down exactly my thoughts on it and why I'm a little hesitant about this new documentary. But then we'll get into the Group of Five playoff a little bit. The American Conference Commissioner came out and said that he was very much in favor of a Group of Five playoff to kind of be added into the fold along with the 12-team playoff, and that's obviously a very interesting thing to unpack, so we'll get into that a little bit today before we continue on with where the top contender seasons will be decided. We'll give you 4 games where I'm really circling for these teams to go 4-0, to go 3-1, what have you, but really show that they're big-time championship contenders this year. And then we have some hot takes around the contenders in the Big Ten. We're about to wrap up this segment. We've gone through the Big 12 and the ACC. We'll do the SEC tomorrow, but today we'll focus on the Big Ten and a ton to break down in that conference. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all, we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the Tip and Donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and I think that's always good for the both of us. Again, if you want to use that, that is gsmcpodcast.net. But let's jump right in and let's talk about this new realignment stuff, because obviously we got the news that Clemson and Florida State are staying put for the time being in the ACC. They will be in the ACC through the 2025-26 season, and then we'll kind of see what happens from there. It sounds like the Big 12 is the going favorite to kind of get their services going forward after those seasons, so that'll obviously be very interesting to watch. But I tend to look at this as kind of a waypoint in between what is going to be probably a crazy next couple of years. I think we're going to have a little bit of a break here, and it came at the perfect time going into a season that is going to be just off the walls incredible for a million different reasons that actually we'll break down tomorrow. But there's a ton of stuff that's going into this year, and I think we got this break, so to speak, at the very perfect time. But I think on the other side of it, we're going to have an absolutely crazy thing to deal with. And I think they kind of starts with Clemson and Florida State, obviously, with them hypothetically going to the Big 12 and joining that conference, and Big 12 kind of bolstering that a little bit more. We've talked about how aggressive Brett Yormark is going to be. I can't imagine that it would stop at Clemson and Florida State, especially if the ACC started to bleed a couple of more teams as they went a little bit further down the road. So this is obviously going to be the first domino to fall. Clemson and Florida State, those court cases being resolved and them finding a new place to play, likely the Big 12, that's going to be domino number 1, and that'll probably fall at some point in the next 2 years, and then officially will fall at the beginning of the 2026 season. But there's a million other things that can happen because of that, and I think the biggest thing here is the Big Ten is just sitting and waiting, and I think that's the scary part here, is the Big Ten is just sitting back and saying, okay, you guys can deal with Florida State and Clemson. I'm not necessarily super worried about adding them to the fold, especially because they're not AAU members, but once some other teams become available, they're going to jump at the idea. I can almost promise you that. So it's not only about Clemson and Florida State in this scenario where, sure, the ACC would be more than fine if they were only to lose those two, but UNC and Virginia have gotten a lot of smoke around the Big Ten, and the Big Ten kind of looking in that direction. If it was to happen that the Florida State and Clemsons of the world were to step away from the ACC, that gives you the opening to go grab these two teams. And I think these two teams will probably jump at that opportunity because, frankly, there's not a lot of teams that wouldn't jump at the opportunity to leave the ACC for the Big Ten. It's just Florida State and Clemson didn't get that invite. But I think UNC and Virginia absolutely would. And then you kind of have just a rolling ball that would be very, very hard to stop. So I think it would start kind of this big-time landslide in the ACC, and obviously that would add to the other side of things. You know, you have the ACC kind of figured out of who's leaving. they got to add teams back, because at the end of the day, you want to stay viable as a conference. You have to stay above that 15 team moniker in the ESPN contract to keep that alive. And there's been some rumors that the Big Ten is trying to torpedo that anyway. So it'll be really interesting to kind of watch that unfold. But the reality is, maybe they have to go down to the group of 5 level and go find some teams that can fit what they do. Maybe they have to go find, some teams that aren't necessarily as interesting as the Florida State and Clemsons of the world. Maybe it is an App State, a Troy, a JMU, someone like that can kind of add to this. Maybe you sub like a USF for a Miami, and obviously it's not necessarily the fairest trade in the world for the ACC, but it at least keeps them viable, at least keeps them a conference, and at least gives them any seat at the table rather than them entirely crumbling and becoming kind of like the Pac-12, where you feel like you have all these options in the world to kind of, the world is your oyster in a sense, but you don't really. I mean, you only have a couple of teams out there, and that has put them in a really bad position. That could be the reality for the ACC if they're not careful over the next couple of years. So if it does mean adding an App State in the place of a UNC or a USF in the place of a Miami, it's not ideal, but at least gives you a group of 5 conference type feel and gives you a shot at this thing to stay in the conversation. So that's obviously going to be really, really interesting to watch. Excuse me, I apologize. It's going to be really, really interesting to watch the ACC kind of unfold over the next little bit, but that's only a piece of the conversation, right? Obviously, the people going into and out of the ACC is going to be likely the biggest thing that happens. That's likely going to be where we see the biggest movement, but that doesn't necessarily mean there's not going to be movement around them, because I think there's going to be a ton. I think it starts with the Pac-12, where you don't really know what they're going to do. These two teams are sitting out there in the Pacific Northwest, and for a long time it felt like they were in a really good spot. It felt like they were almost in a better spot than a couple of the other conferences, including the ACC, because they could kind of go where they please. They could kind of make their own decisions, go about the way that they want to go about it, and they were getting a ton of money from the teams that were exiting the Pac-12 over the next little bit. So it felt like those two teams were in a position where maybe they weren't going to absolutely dominate and be able to just pick and choose where they wanted to go, but there was going to be a landing point. There was going to be a spot where they could get on the off-ramp and actually deal with the issues that are in front of them. That has not presented itself, and frankly, it's gotten further away from that, with the Mountain West not being quite as interested in joining with these two as we once thought they would be. So that's obviously going to be a huge part of this, where the Pac-12's got to make a decision at some point, whether it's joining the Big 12 and kind of maybe not taking the media rights deal for the time being just to get into that conference, or it's merging with the Mountain West and kind of just leaning over to them, getting rid of the Pac-12 moniker, joining the Mountain West, and maybe merging with another big-time conference. Who knows what it looks like for these two schools, but they're going to play a huge part in this next realignment kind of cycle, and it's going to be one of those things that we're going to have to watch really, really closely, because they could totally dictate, how the group of 5 conferences look over the next little bit, with a merger between maybe the American and the Mountain West, which has been kicked around. And there's some different ideas out there, but they definitely hold a lot of power when it comes to what the sport is going to look like in terms of conferences going forward. But I think the biggest thing here is there's teams in that ACC conference that frankly want out but just aren't saying it right now, or at least that's the way I tend to think. I obviously, you don't have too much information, because a lot of this happens behind closed doors, but you have a ton of teams in that conference that would start looking at the door very, very quickly. UNC and Virginia would likely top that list. I think the Big Ten would be just absolutely banging down the door to grab those two out of that conference because of the AAU accreditation, because of the revenue they make behind the scenes, away from football, away from sports in general, with some of the endowments they get and everything in between. These are huge, huge brands, and they absolutely would fit into the Big Ten. And then you have other teams. I think Duke and Miami would probably be the next on the list that would have to find somewhere else to play, because Miami and Duke frankly just don't belong in a conference that is not a Power 4 conference. Both of those entities absolutely deserve to be in the SEC, in the Big 10, in the Big 12, in one of these conferences that is going to mean a lot going into the next little bit. So I can't imagine that they're going to sit there over the next 2 years and watch Florida State and Clemson have one foot out the door, and watch, maybe UNC and Virginia start to flirt with the idea of leaving the conference and moving somewhere else, and not say that they want in on that too. Obviously, there's going to be hurdles to get to that, the same way there are hurdles for Florida State and Clemson, but Florida State and Clemson are opening a door that is going to be really hard to shut because there's going to be a lot of teams pushing it right back open when it's starting to close. So I think that's going to be kind of the biggest thing here is you have two teams right now that the ACC has to worry about more than anything else, right? Florida State and Clemson are the teams that you really have to hone in on and make sure that they are in good shape. But it doesn't mean that's the end all be all. It doesn't mean that, there's necessarily an end in sight after those two leave, because the reality is whether it's, the ACC or the Big 12 or the SEC, Big 10, it doesn't matter. There's going to be conferences that are coming after these ACC teams, and there's going to be ones that they're going to want to leave for. I mean, the SEC and the Big 10 are the two that absolutely you'd want to leave for, but if you get 2 years down the road and Clemson and Florida State are making their way into the Big 12, there's no reality, in my opinion, where the ACC would get a bigger cut of that college football playoff than the Big 12, because you just took two big-time names in the ACC and handed them over to the conference that they're fighting for that third spot. So I think it would be really interesting to kind of watch this unfold, but the reality is we've kind of hit a little bit of a lull in this conference realignment stuff. We've hit a moment where we can kind of breathe and focus on football for the time being, which couldn't have come at a more perfect time with fall camp starting and the 2024 season being one of the craziest in the world. But I do think there's going to be a huge landslide right after it. I do think there's going to be a moment over the next 2 years where we realize there's going to be as much change as we have ever seen it. And maybe there's not, a Texas or OU going anywhere. Maybe there's not, these big time moves with the Big Ten adding 4 teams or anything crazy. But there's going to be a lot of movement, whether that's the Group of 5 level, the Power 5 level. There's going to be a lot of movement that's going to define the way we see these conferences going forward and the way that college football is just structured going forward. So there's going to be a lot of questions. Do we have a Power 3 by the time we get to 27? Is it just the Big 12, SEC, and Big 10? That tends to be the way that I think, but hopefully that's not the case, obviously. But then you could also have Group of 5 schools could kind of merge into different conferences. You could have the American and the Sun Belt become one conference together and try to build up themselves a little bit more. So there's a million different things that could happen, but we've hit a little bit of a lull. We've hit a little bit of a off-ramp, but there's definitely a little bit more coming, and it's going to be very, very intense when it does, and I think it's going to be the biggest movement that we've seen. Not necessarily the most impactful with some of the big-time teams moving, but it's definitely going to be the most teams moving. I feel pretty confident about that. But we'll obviously break that down as it kind of unfolds. But let's take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about a documentary that Netflix is making around Connor Stallions and the sign-stealing scandal that happened at Michigan a year ago or over the last couple of years. And I'll break down exactly why I don't necessarily feel too great about this. But I'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.